The gun went off before anyone had time to scream. Hazel heard it, a sharp crack splitting the low hum of a hotel ballroom, and in the half-second that followed, she did not think. She moved. The boy was standing 3 feet to her left, holding a glass of sparkling water he wasn't allowed to drink, wearing a suit that was too big for his small shoulders. 7 years old, maybe 8. He'd been trailing behind the big man in the grey suit all evening, trying to keep up with steps that were twice the length of his own. Hazel had noticed him earlier because he reminded her of her nephew back home in Sudbury, that same look of trying very hard not to look lost. When the second shot came, she threw herself sideways. She didn't feel the impact right away. That's the thing nobody tells you about getting shot. There's a moment where your body simply refuses to accept what's happened. She hit the marble floor hard, the boy pinned under her, and it was only when she tried to push herself up that her left side stopped working entirely, and the world tilted sideways in a way that had nothing to do with the fall. She heard shouting. She heard the boy say something she couldn't make out. Then there was a man crouching over her, and even through the blur she registered the grey suit, the jaw set hard as a cliff face, the eyes, dark, controlled, and currently doing something she did not expect from a man who looked like that. They were afraid. "Don't move," he said. His voice was low and even, like someone used to giving orders in rooms where panic was not an option. "Do not move." "I'm fine," she said, which was clearly not true. "You are not fine," the boy. "He's here. He's safe." A pause, and she caught the sound of a child crying softly somewhere close. "Because of you." Hazel Brennan had come to the Carrington Hotel that evening because she needed the money. That sounds simpler than it was. Everything in her life at that point could be reduced to that sentence, but the weight of it was different than it might sound. She wasn't broke in the way people are when they've been careless or unlucky with ordinary things. She was broke the way you get when you've spent 2 years paying for someone else's survival. Her younger sister, Danny, had been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at 26, the kind that blindsided you because you'd been healthy your whole life, and then suddenly you weren't. In Canada, the diagnosis itself wasn't the catastrophe. The cost of keeping her stable was. Insulin, continuous glucose monitors, the specialist in Toronto she'd needed after the first bad episode, the weeks Danny couldn't work and the bills that kept arriving anyway. Their parents were gone. There was no one else. Hazel had done the math every month for 2 years, and each month the math had not worked, and she had found a way anyway. She was 31 years old, and she worked 3 jobs. She cleaned offices 3 mornings a week for a building management company. She did alterations and tailoring out of her apartment on weeknights. And twice a month, she picked up catering shifts with a company called Prestige Events, which was how she'd ended up in a ballroom at the Carrington that Saturday, in a black uniform and soft-soled shoes, carrying a tray of canapés she would never be able to afford to eat. She had not expected the evening to go the way it did. The gala was a charity event. At least that's what was printed on the signage. Children's foundations, hospital wings, the kind of names that made people feel good about dressing up and spending money. Hazel had worked enough of these events to know that the charity was usually real and the people were usually complicated. She kept her head down, kept her tray full, kept her eyes where they were supposed to be. She'd first noticed the boy because of the suit. It was expensive, she could tell by the cut, which was her job to notice, but it had been tailored for a body that had since grown a centimeter or 2 in the shoulders. Someone hadn't updated his measurements recently. He stood near the bar where the men in real power stood, and he was doing that thing children do when they're trying to become invisible without actually leaving, hands folded, gaze fixed somewhere neutral. She'd brought him a sparkling water when she passed, just slid it onto the table beside him without making a big deal of it. He'd looked up and said, very quietly, "Thank you." She'd moved on. 40 minutes later, that boy was the reason she was lying on a marble floor trying to remember how to breathe. The man in the grey suit was named Callum Voss. She learned this later, much later, after the hospital, after the surgery, after the days that blurred together in a haze of painkillers and fluorescent light and a very patient nurse named Gloria, who kept telling her to stop trying to sit up too fast. Callum Voss was not, officially, anything dangerous. He ran a private equity firm headquartered in Vancouver and had offices in Calgary and Montreal. He appeared in business news the way certain men do, briefly, cleanly, never saying more than necessary. He donated to things, he attended the right events, he was photographed occasionally at functions like the one she'd been working, always at the edge of the frame, always alone. What Callum Voss was unofficially was a different conversation, and it was one that Hazel did not fully understand until she was already too far inside it to leave cleanly. The boy's name was Ben. He was 8 years old. He was Callum Voss's son, and his mother had died 19 months ago, and he had not, According to the one time, Callum mentioned it with the careful neutrality of someone managing a wound, spoken very much since. He had spoken to Hazel. Not in the ballroom, not that night. She'd been unconscious for a significant portion of that evening and recovering for the days that followed. But when she woke up in the private room at Vancouver General, there was a small arrangement of grocery store tulips on the windowsill and a folded piece of paper on the bedside table. She opened it. "Thank you for saving my dad's son," it said in the careful printing of someone who was still working out the correct use of possessives. Then, underneath, "I'm Ben. I'm 8. I hope you feel better soon." She read it twice. Then she cried, which surprised her, because Hazel Brennan was not generally a crier. She was the kind of person who held it together and dealt with things and kept moving, because she'd learned early that stopping to feel it meant falling behind, and she didn't have the margin for that. But something about the handwriting, the earnest imprecision of it, the way he'd gotten the grammar almost right, broke something open in her she hadn't known was closed. She was still holding the note when Callum Voss walked in. He looked different in daylight, away from the controlled atmosphere of the ballroom. Not softer exactly, that wasn't the word for him, but more present. He was wearing a dark jacket over a plain shirt, no tie, and he looked like someone who had slept 4 hours over the past 2 days, which she would later learn was accurate. He stopped when he saw the note in her hand. He insisted on writing it himself, Callum said. "I want you to know I tried to help him with the grammar." "It's perfect," she said. He pulled the chair closer to the bed, not all the way, leaving a proper distance, and sat down with his elbows on his knees, hands together. It was the posture of someone who needed to say something they hadn't entirely worked out yet. "I owe you more than I know how to put in a sentence," he said. "You don't owe me anything. That's not true. I saw a child in danger. I moved. Anyone would have done the same." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "They wouldn't have." She didn't argue because she'd had that argument with herself already in the thin hours of the previous night, and she wasn't sure she'd won it. She didn't know, truly, what she would have done if she'd had a second to think about it. She only knew what she'd done in the moment when there wasn't time to think, and whether that said something real about her character or only about her reflexes was a question she didn't feel ready to answer yet. "How is he?" she asked instead. Something crossed Callum's face. Relief, maybe, that the conversation had shifted. "Shaken, but physically fine." A pause. "He asked about you. He doesn't know me." "No," Callum said, but that's never stopped him from caring about people. She didn't know what to say to that. Before she could figure it out, he continued. "The people who came to that event, the ones who fired those shots, they were targeting me. The shooter misidentified Ben as an easier leverage point." His voice stayed even, but she heard what was underneath it. Something controlled, the way you control a fire that still wants to burn through everything. You saw his face. The second shooter. You were close enough, she remembered. Brief, half a second, but the kind of image that prints itself somewhere behind your eyes and stays. "They know you saw him," Callum said. "That makes you a target." The room was quiet. "Okay," she said. He looked at her. "That's all you have to say. I don't know what the alternative is. It happened. I can't unsee him." He nodded slowly, like she'd answered a question he hadn't asked out loud. "I'd like to make sure you're protected while we sort this out. There's a suite at my residence. Secure, private. My head of household staff can help you with anything you need while you recover." He paused. "I know how this sounds. I know you don't know me." "You're right," she said. "I don't. Then I'll tell you this. I've been keeping my son safe for 8 years in circumstances most people don't know exist. I have not lost anyone under my protection." Another pause. "But I understand if you'd rather make other arrangements. I can have security posted here instead." She thought about her apartment, the second-floor walk-up in East Van she shared with her sister's medical bills. Danny at home right now, probably trying to call her for the 3rd time. "My sister," she said. "She needs to know I'm okay, and she needs." Hazel stopped. "Tell me," he said, not impatiently, just directly. "She has type 1 diabetes. She needs access to her medication without disruption. Whatever arrangement we make, she has to be part of it." Callum Voss looked at her for a long moment. "Of course," he said. The Voss residence was not what she'd expected, which meant she hadn't known what to expect and had braced herself anyway. It was a house in West Vancouver. Large, yes, but not ostentatious in the way of people who needed you to notice their money. It sat in the trees above the water and looked, from the outside, like a place that had been built to last rather than to impress. The inside was orderly and quiet and faintly cool, and there were original art pieces on the walls that Hazel recognized weren't decorating so much as thinking out loud. She moved carefully, still tender from the surgery, one hand sometimes on the wall when the corridor was long, and her side reminded her of itself. Ben found her on the second morning. She was in the kitchen. She'd woken early, couldn't sleep, and had made herself a cup of tea without asking, which she slightly regretted and slightly didn't. And he came in wearing pajamas with small whales on them, and he stopped when he saw her, and then he didn't leave. "You're the woman from the party," he said. "I am." "My name is Hazel." He considered this. Like the color, like the nut. He pulled out the stool across from her and climbed up onto it, apparently having decided this was a reasonable place to be. "How come you're here? I'm staying here for a bit while I get better. Because your side hurts. Because my side hurts." He nodded, accepting this. He had his father's coloring, dark hair, sharp features, but his eyes were lighter, a warm gray, and they moved around a room the way curious people's eyes do, touching things briefly before moving on. "Does it hurt a lot?" he asked. "Only when I breathe wrong. That seems hard to avoid." "It is, a bit." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but something in that direction. "I'm Ben. I know. You wrote me a note." He looked down at the counter. "Dad helped me with the spelling," he told me. "He said you insisted on writing it yourself." Ben seemed to consider whether this was embarrassing. He appeared to decide it wasn't. "Someone should say thank you properly," he said, with the gravity of someone who had very clear ideas about what properly meant, not just have someone else say it. Hazel looked at him, this small person in whale pajamas sitting in his enormous kitchen at 6 in the morning, entirely serious, and felt something shift quietly in her chest. "It was the best thing I woke up to." He glanced up. This time it was a smile, small and real, and she thought, there it is. Living in the Voss house was strange in ways she hadn't prepared for. The staff were professional and kind, and asked her very little. Her sister Danny had been brought in for the first week. Hazel had insisted, and Callum had arranged it without comment, which told her something about him she filed away and thought about later. Danny had spent those days in the guest room adjacent to hers, marveling at the house and its views, and periodically appearing in the doorway to say things like, "Hazel, there are 3 kinds of sparkling water in the fridge," in a tone of someone who had discovered a new continent. Callum kept a distance that was careful without being cold. He ate dinner with Ben most evenings. Hazel joined them after the first week, when standing up for longer stretches had stopped feeling like a negotiation, and he was different around his son than he was otherwise. Less contained, not warm exactly or not easily warm, but attentive in the way of someone who had decided that paying attention was the form love took when you weren't sure how to say it. Ben, for his part, had decided Hazel was someone worth knowing. He brought her things. A book about migratory birds he thought she might find interesting. A drawing he'd done in school that he described carefully before handing over, as if providing context would help her appreciate it properly. He told her about his school, about a boy in his class named Oliver who had, apparently, very strong opinions about sandwiches, and about the fact that he was learning the guitar but found the F chord unreasonably difficult. "Everyone finds the F chord unreasonable," Hazel told him. "Did you play guitar?" "For a few years. I'm out of practice." "Could you still play it?" She thought about it. Maybe, if someone had one. He was gone for less than 2 minutes and returned with an acoustic guitar that was clearly his, a 3/4 size, slightly out of tune, with a small sticker of a whale on the body. She adjusted her position carefully and tuned it by ear, and then she played the F chord, which took 1 attempt and came out clean. Ben looked at her with an expression she recognized as the one children make when an adult has done something genuinely impressive rather than impressive for an adult. She played a bit of something simple, a folk song she'd learned as a teenager that had no particular significance except that her fingers still knew it, and when she stopped, the kitchen was quiet. Ben said, "My mum used to hum when she cooked." She didn't rush past it. That was the thing about children. They said the true thing and you could either honor it or skip over it, and she'd learned with her nephew that skipping over it was always the wrong choice. "What did she hum?" Hazel asked. "I don't always remember anymore." He looked at the guitar. "It bothers me sometimes." "That's normal," she said. "The harder you try to hold something exactly, the more it slips. But it doesn't go away. It just changes shape." He was quiet for a moment. "Dad says she'd want me to be happy. I think he's right." "Do you think she'd mind that I like you?" The question landed softly. "No," Hazel said after a moment. "I don't think she'd mind at all." Callum found her that night on the back terrace. She hadn't heard him come out. He moved quietly for a man his size, and for a moment neither of them spoke. They stood side by side and looked at the water below, the lights from the North Shore breaking into pieces on the surface. "Ben talked about you at dinner," he said. "After you'd gone in. Good things, I hope. He said you played the F chord on the first try and that this was proof you were, quote, exceptionally capable." She smiled despite herself. That's a lot of weight to put on one guitar chord. He's been assigning people character ratings based on skills he personally finds difficult. He told me last week that the man who delivers groceries is a 7 out of 10 because he can reverse a large van into a narrow space. A slight pause. 6.5. I lost points for the F chord. He's apparently been struggling with it for 3 weeks. She laughed, and it pulled at her side, and she pressed her hand there briefly. Sorry, he said, which surprised her. Don't be. It's worth it then. He smiled tonight, at the table, telling me about the guitar. It was. He stopped. She waited. It's been a long time since I've seen him do that easily, Callum said. Not with sentiment, exactly. He didn't seem built for that kind of openness, but with the plainness of someone saying a true thing because it needed to be said. I don't know what you said to him this afternoon, but I'm grateful. We just talked. He doesn't talk to many people. He talks well when he decides you're worth talking to. Callum turned his head slightly to look at her. She could feel the attention without meeting his eyes. You're very good with him, he said. I have a nephew I'm close to, and I think children mostly need someone to take them seriously. Most people don't, I know. Another stretch of quiet, but not the uncomfortable kind, the kind you can sit inside. I have to tell you something, Callum said. She looked at him. The arrangement, you being here, the people we're dealing with know that you're under my protection. My associates are aware of it. A pause. It was necessary for your safety that I made certain representations. To people who operate by a particular set of rules. She was starting to understand some things. He was looking at the water. I told them you were under my personal protection. That you were not. He seemed to choose the word carefully. Someone separate from my household. Hazel thought about this. You told them I was your partner, yes. And that means something specific in the context of what you do. It means you're off limits. It means anyone who touches you is answering to me directly. He paused. I want to be clear that I did this to protect you, not to create an obligation for you. Nothing about your actual situation changes. But in the interests of transparency, you should know what I told them and why. She looked at the water. Okay, she said. He turned to look at her properly this time. That's twice now you've said okay to something I expected to be more complicated. Would a more complicated response help? No, but it might be more understandable. She thought about how to explain it. I worked 3 jobs for 2 years to keep my sister alive. I don't have a lot of energy for complicating things that don't need to be complicated. You made a decision to protect me that also happened to protect Ben. And that's the situation. I'll figure out the rest as we go. He was quiet for a moment. 3 jobs, he said. Office cleaning, alterations, catering. The alterations. That's why you noticed the suit. She looked at him. What suit? Ben's. At the gala. You noticed it was slightly off in the shoulders. He held her gaze. He told me. He said the lady who gave him the water looked at his jacket like she was deciding something. She felt something strange and small move through her. I noticed tailoring, its habit. He asked if I could get it adjusted. A slight pause, and again that thing underneath the evenness, something careful and real. He's never asked for anything like that before. The suit was his grandfather's gift. He'd been wearing it wrong for months and never mentioned it. She thought about that small boy trying to keep up with steps twice the length of his own. He was trying to fit into something that wasn't quite fitted for him, she said. Yes, she looked at the water. Kids do that. Try to be the right size for things that haven't adjusted to them yet. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, quietly, so do adults. The gala, where it almost fell apart, was 3 weeks later. Callum had obligations he couldn't cancel, a formal dinner for a foundation he'd supported for years, and backing out would have sent the wrong signal to the wrong people. He'd asked Hazel carefully if she felt well enough to attend alongside him. Not required. Her choice. But the presence would consolidate the protection. She'd said yes. She wore a dress she'd altered herself. She'd found the fabric at a shop on Granville, deep green, nothing that required explanation. And she put her hair up in a way that her mother used to call serious, which meant it looked like she'd made a decision. The dinner was held in a private room at a restaurant in Yaletown, and everyone was polite and impeccably dressed and watching each other with the peripheral attention of people who'd learned to gather information without appearing to. She sat beside Callum, and ate and listened and said the right things when the right things were called for, and she was doing fine until she saw the ring. It was on the hand of a man 3 seats down, a man who'd been introduced as a business associate from Montreal, who'd been careful and unremarkable all evening, who'd shaken her hand when they were introduced with the mild disinterest of someone marking her as unimportant. But she'd seen that ring before. It was distinctive. A flat band with an unusual inlay, silver, and a dark stone she'd later learn was onyx, in a pattern she'd registered and filed away and not been able to name. She'd seen it for half a second in the chaos of the ballroom at the Carrington, on the hand pressed against the shoulder of the man who'd fired the second shot. She was a person who noticed detail. It was her job to notice detail. Her hand moved to Callum's forearm under the table. Light, just fingers. He didn't look at her, but she felt him go still. She kept her face even and her voice quiet, and she said, near his ear, the way people say things at dinner tables when they don't want to carry across the room. 3 seats down. The ring. A pause of about 2 seconds. Then under the table his hand covered hers. Once. Brief. She understood. She stayed calm for the remainder of the dinner. She engaged in conversation when it was required. She ate the dessert course. She kept her eyes away from the man 3 seats down with the kind of deliberateness that looks like natural disinterest. When they left, Callum's hand was at the small of her back. Not possessively, but steadily, and she could feel in the pressure of his palm that things were moving around them even as they walked calmly to the car. In the back seat, heading north, he said, "You're sure?" "I'm sure." "That's a significant thing to be sure about." "I know." She looked at the passing city. The ring was on his right hand, second finger. Silver band, onyx inlay, geometric pattern. He pressed that hand flat against the wall at the Carrington when he turned toward the exit, and I was close enough that I was looking directly at it when I went down. A silence. "You held on to that detail," he said. "It stuck." "For 3 weeks. Some things stick whether you want them to or not." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Are you all right?" She thought about it honestly. "Yes, I think so." "That was well done, Hazel." She looked at the window. The lights of the Lion's Gate were coming into view, and beyond them the dark water and the dark trees and the house where Ben was asleep, probably with the guitar close by. "Will it be handled?" she asked. "Yes." And then a pause. "And then we'll talk about what comes next, if you want that conversation." She turned and looked at him directly for the first time since they'd left the restaurant. He was watching her the way he sometimes did, like he was paying attention to something he didn't entirely understand yet but had decided deserved his full attention. "I'd like that conversation," she said. What came next arrived in pieces, the way things do when they're real. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't a declaration. It was Callum finding her in the kitchen at 7 in the morning, when she was trying to figure out if she'd oversteeped her tea, and standing there for a moment too long before saying anything, and her looking up and them both being aware, suddenly and simultaneously, that the kitchen didn't feel like somewhere either of them was passing through. It was Ben at dinner, saying with the directness of a child who had decided something, "I think you should stay." Hazel had looked at him. "What makes you say that?" "Because Dad laughs more when you're here. And also because you helped me with the F chord and I finally got it, and it seems wrong that you wouldn't be here when I can actually play the whole song." Callum said, "Ben," quiet the way parents say a child's name when they're trying to establish a limit and privately agree entirely. Ben looked at his father. "It's true." Hazel said to her plate, "I'd like to hear the whole song when it's ready." Callum said nothing for a moment. Then, "So would I." It was at a dinner table in West Vancouver, an answer to something that hadn't quite been asked. She understood it anyway. That was the thing about careful men. They didn't say everything, but what they did say, they meant completely. Danny called her that night and said, "Tell me everything," in the voice she used when she already knew more than she was letting on. "There's not much to tell," Hazel said. "Hazel, I might stay a little longer." A pause. "Because of the security situation." And the other part, she stood at the window and looked at the trees and the water below, and thought about Ben's handwriting and guitar chords, and a man who'd gone still when her hand touched his arm. "I'll explain when I see you," she said. Danny made a sound that contained a full sentence's worth of satisfaction and said, "Take your time." The last thing to resolve was the part she hadn't asked about directly. She asked it on a Thursday evening, after Ben had gone to bed, while she and Callum were both reading in the same room in the way they'd gradually started doing, independently, without particular comment, which was somehow the most comfortable arrangement she'd found in years. "The representation you made," she said, "to the people who needed to know, that I was your partner." He looked up. "Does that need to be undone? When things are settled?" He was quiet for long enough that she looked back at her book. "I don't want to undo it," he said. She kept her eyes on the page for a moment. "I'd need things to be honest," she said. "Not just safe, actually honest. So would I, and ordinary sometimes. My sister coming for Sunday dinner. Ben practicing guitar in the kitchen. Things that are. She paused, trying to find the word. "Unguarded. That's what I want, too." A pause. "I'm not particularly good at unguarded. I know you're getting better." He was quiet again. Then low and careful, the way he said the things that mattered. "I'd like to try. With you. If that's..." He stopped. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "I haven't finished the sentence. I know. Yes." Something moved across his face that she'd only seen once or twice in real. "Hazel," he said. "Callum." He almost smiled. She'd learned to recognize almost. That was enough for now. That was more than enough. Outside, the city was lit and alive, and somewhere upstairs a small boy was asleep next to a guitar with a whale sticker on it. And in the morning he would come down for breakfast, and the three of them would be in the same kitchen in the early light. Whatever word you gave it, it was something that had started the night she moved without thinking toward a child in danger. She thought, in the quiet of the room, that she'd do it again. Not for what it had given her, but because in that half-second, with no time to decide, she had found out something about herself she'd needed to know. That when it counted, she moved toward the people who needed protecting, and she didn't stop to calculate the cost. Some things, she thought, are just who you are.